Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Monday, 28 July, 2025. In my episode on Fernand Braudel, I laid out his tripartite distinction among the history of the event, the history of the conjuncture, and the longue durée. This is a sequence of historical scales of time from the shortest, the history of the event, to the longest, the longue durée. And it's the longue durée with which Braudel and structuralist history, generally speaking, is associated with in particular. Braudel wrote on the longue durée, which he also simply called structure, quote, "Over and above the recitative of the conjuncture, structural history, or the history of the longue durée, inquires into whole centuries at a time. It functions along the border between the moving and the immobile, and because of the long-standing stability of its values, it appears unchanging compared with all the histories which flow and work themselves out more swiftly, and which in the final analysis gravitate around it," unquote. Braudel also wrote about what he called material civilization, which emphasized the nearly unchanging elements that go into civilizations in the form of slow, incremental changes in the land, in the population, in material resources, and the like. That is to say, the stable material factors that enter into a civilization. It's true enough that the landscape changes slowly, but there are other slow-acting forces at work in history in addition to these material factors. In my episode on Schopenhauer, I quoted him to the effect that intellectual history, and more narrowly, the history of philosophy, is the background against which historical events unfold. Quote, "There are two kinds of history, the history of politics and the history of literature and art. The one is the history of the will, the other that of the intellect. The first is a tale of woe, even of terror. It is a record of agony, struggle, fraud, and horrible murder en masse. The second is everywhere pleasing and serene, like the intellect when left to itself, even though its path be one of error. Its chief branch is the history of philosophy. This is, in fact, its fundamental base, and the notes of it are heard even in the other kind of history. These deep tones guide the formation of opinion, and opinion rules the world. Hence, philosophy, rightly understood, is a material force of the most powerful kind, though very slow in its working. The philosophy of a period is thus the fundamental base of its history," unquote. It's interesting that both Braudel and Schopenhauer express themselves in musical metaphors, with Braudel appealing to operatic recitative, while Schopenhauer appeals to the fundamental base. The fundamental base to which Schopenhauer referred was a term introduced by Jean-Philippe Rameau in a famous work on musical theory, his treatise on harmony of 1722, which argued for a natural basis for tonal music, and which, in a sense, then defined Western music until Schoenberg's atonalism. Rameau wrote in his treatise on harmony, quote, "It is always by the division of the single fundamental sound itself that all other sounds, and consequently all intervals and chords, are generated. The fundamental sound is their beginning and end. This octave has only those properties communicated to it by the fundamental sound which generated it," unquote. The fundamental base, then, isn't just the root note of the chord. It is that out of which all music and out of which all harmony grows. In other words, for Schopenhauer, philosophy was laying it down for the rest of history. Schopenhauer also thought that music was an expression of the will, a more direct expression of the will than the other arts, and that the will was the thing in itself of Kantian philosophy, not mere appearance, but reality. And this makes philosophy fundamental to the nature of reality for Schopenhauer. Intellectual history moves very slowly, as Schopenhauer observed, as befits the Longue Durée. It's the structure upon which all other historical structures are built, so it needs to be stable. And the working out of ideas in the historical process is possibly the slowest process of human history, of all human history processes of human history. But as slowly as intellectual history moves, the natural history of which it is a part moves even more slowly. And it moves the more slowly as we ascend to more comprehensive and thus also to more fundamental historical processes. For example, as we ascend, I should say, in temporal scale from human thought to biology, to geology, and ultimately to cosmology. Given a naturalistic conception of history, the slow movement of intellectual history is the expression in consciousness of the fundamental features of the world. When the universe produces something new, which it does when a new threshold of emergent complexity is met, this is the material equivalent of a new idea. And when a conscious mind grasps this new existent and forms a concept derived from an abstract grasp of that existent, the new idea that the universe produced materially is now made explicit in a conscious mind. That is to say, it's not only materially explicit, but it's also formally explicit. And the discipline that does this most explicitly is philosophy, which seeks to capture the most general features of the world in explicitly formulated concepts. And the more explicitly formulated, the better. And in this way, we can show a continuity between the slow-moving intellectual movement of human history with the history that preceded any conscious mind able to grasp that history. Beginning at the beginning of our universe, emergent complexities were slow to pile up at first. But once life got started on Earth, new emergent complexities have been thrown up one after another, and now we have a technologically sophisticated civilization that is perched on the verge of projecting itself out into the universe at large, bringing the emergent complexities of our home world to other worlds where they can continue to thrive as long as the universe endures. With this rapid sequence of emergent complexities on Earth over the past 4.5 billion years, history seems to have greatly sped up. And today we are increasingly familiar with a world in which change seems to be the only constant. In the midst of this accelerating social change, largely driven by rapid technological change, it may be a bit difficult to believe that some aspects of human history actually take longer than they took in the past, but I think this can be shown to be the case. Our longer lives, our access to resources, our burgeoning tradition to which each writer incrementally adds in turn, means that there's always more for later generations to assimilate than earlier generations had to assimilate. The long process of the assimilation of this growing tradition becomes more daunting and more difficult over time. It begins with written records, with the invention of written language, which appears in several different geographical regions starting about 5,000 years before present. But it's not until ancient civilizations reach a kind of initial maturity that actual histories are written. Today, we reconstruct the histories of societies that don't write their own histories. But the ancient world was mostly just trying to give an account of itself. The advent of history was itself a novel event in history, and this only occurred about 2,500 years ago, halfway through the history of written language today. So there's a sense in which our history is deep and reaches back to the origins of time. But there's another sense in which historical consciousness is relatively shallow in terms of this deep history of which contemporary science has made us aware. The written records of the classical world had a definite beginning in time and a definite end in time. In this tradition, the world of classical antiquity left a finite literary record of itself in the forms of the surviving books of the ancient world. In fact, this record was so rigorously finite that a diligent scholar could expect to master the literature of classical antiquity in the original languages. And many scholars did this. The task is, you could say, well within the scope of a human being who exerts themselves. The civilization of classical antiquity then left a finite literary record of self which was available to scholars of later civilizations, both medieval civilization and modern civilization. And they could take that legacy up as a whole and form an estimate of that now vanished civilization. And judgments were formed of classical antiquity on the basis of the overview of what the classical world left to us in its finite and complete record. The most famous example of taking advantage of this record was, of course, Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The literary legacy of classical antiquity, while large, is finite, and that many scholars have mastered this literature is in striking contrast to the situation today. Scholars of the Middle Ages themselves mastered what was available to them of the literary legacy of antiquity. And with Renaissance scholars like Petrarch, the search to discover the literary legacy of antiquity began in earnest. And in our time, it's not likely that more works will be found. But medieval writers also added to the legacy of classical antiquity with their own books and commentaries on the books of classical antiquity. This medieval legacy is also finite, consisting of another 1,000 years worth of writing. And I suspect that, while finite, it's probably larger than the corpus of classical antiquity. While this tradition is nearer to us in time than classical antiquity, it's less well known. And while it could be mastered in principle by an individual, as the literature of antiquity could be mastered by an individual, there are practical limits to the mastery of the medieval corpus. Also, it'd probably be beyond the scope of any one scholar to master both ancient and medieval literature, though it'd still be possible to master the literature of a single tradition of scholarship that runs throughout the two periods. The project of scholastic philosophy, which would have been, according to Schopenhauer, the fundamental base of medieval history, was never completed, but was really only abandoned during the Renaissance, since the old philosophical project, which was the fundamental base of medieval history, had come to seem pointless, while the new philosophical ideas of the Renaissance seemed exciting and new. As a result of the abandonment of the scholastic project, a lot of scholastic philosophy has never appeared in a modern edition, much less in a modern language. And in this context, a modern edition means any edition since the invention of printing. There are quite a few medieval works that were printed as incunabula in the late 15th century, and then some printed in the 16th century and never printed since then. And in addition to that, a significant quantity of medieval thought remains in manuscript form and has never been printed at all. So one of the practical impediments to mastering the corpus of medieval literature is its inaccessibility. Of course, ancient literature was similarly largely inaccessible during the medieval period until it was systematically excavated from monastic libraries, you could say, during the early modern period, and now is, like I said, almost entirely intact. Well, I mean, what we have is intact, and we're not likely to find what we know to be missing. Still, it's a finite and completed tradition, like the classical tradition, while modernity is still in the making and is still unfinished. With the Renaissance, a new philosophy appears, and that means a new fundamental base is sounded in history, and everyone chooses a new dance partner as a result. Modernity isn't so easily encapsulated as the finite traditions of classical antiquity and the Middle Ages, but its development of its ideas is moving at a predictable snail's pace. The record of each individual thinker is finite, but the overall tradition is still open and increasing in size, and already far larger than the record of classical antiquity, not least because we now print works and can print books and can produce them en masse. Even today in the 21st century, the 19th century is still very much with us, and we are still in a process of assimilating that tradition. If we take, for example, the 4-volume English translation of Bernard Bolzano's Theory of Science. There were earlier partial translations of this work in the 20th century, but the entire book, which was originally published in German in 1837, was only translated in its entirety and published in 2014. While German was in Bolzano's time, and it remains today, an international scholarly language, English is rapidly becoming the default international language, so that the full assimilation of the body of some work is crucially dependent on its translation into English. My point in mentioning Bolzano's Theory of Science is that Bolzano was born in the 18th century. He wrote his treatise in the 19th century, and it's only in the 21st century that it's been made available in its entirety in English. And of course, there are many examples like this. Edmund Husserl's shorthand notebooks are still being transcribed and published. He died in 1938. For several decades, the Husserl archives at Louvain have diligently been working on Husserl's papers, patiently churning out the Husserliana volumes, which mostly get translated to English, though this process can still take decades more to happen. I wouldn't be at all surprised that when the centennial of the archives comes around in 2039, that this process will still be underway and not yet completed. And publications of the volumes is only the beginning of the process of the assimilation of the ideas. The books still have to be read and enter into the thought of some future generation. The collected paper of Paul Bernays probably will be published sometime soon, but the volume, now being edited, hasn't yet been released. Of course, many of Bernays' papers had a considerable influence during his lifetime when they appeared in journals, but in the English-speaking world, it's just his paper, Platonism in Mathematics, that's well known, and much of the remainder of his work has not been published in English at all. The editors of the upcoming volumes of his collected papers state on their website, quote, Paul Bernays is arguably the greatest philosopher of mathematics in the 20th century, unquote. But if this is accurate, then the full impact of his work has yet to be felt in philosophy in the 21st century and in coming centuries. 5 volumes of Kurt Gödel's papers have been published and translated into English. That includes a 3rd volume that consists of previously unpublished papers and 4th and 5th volumes of correspondence. But the bulk of Gödel's philosophical notebooks, widely referred to as Max Phil, consisting of 14 notebooks with 1,576 pages written in Gabelsberg shorthand, are in the process of being transcribed and edited and made available. Given the impact of Gödel's thought on the 20th century, which has already been enormous, when Gödel's philosophical views filter into the intellectual milieu over the coming century, it's possible that they may have a further profound influence. It's also possible that they might not, but that remains. Logic and mathematics, and I've been mentioning philosophical works about these, are the common language of the sciences. And so they constitute the ligaments that tie together the scientific production of new technologies, which are then engineered for industrial production, which are then used to manufacture improved scientific instruments that can then further scientific discovery in turn. And I call this the STEM cycle. This intellectually unifies mathematics, science, technology, and engineering, and in turn constitutes the engine that drives forward our civilization today, which is economically dependent on science. The continued transformation in our understanding of logic and mathematics, as afforded by thinkers like Bolzano, Husserl, Bernays, Gödel, and others, is likely to disproportionately impact our civilization in comparison to non-technological and non-scientific civilizations of the past. These other civilizations, these non-technological civilizations, were disproportionately impacted by different forms of literature. And as we would expect from the Schopenhauerian motif of the fundamental base of a period, The fundamental base of scholastic philosophy was a philosophy tightly coupled with theology, and that was what resonated throughout the period as its fundamental base. In the modern period, it's science, technology, and engineering, and thought about science, technology, and engineering that is the fundamental base of our period of history. An agricultural civilization would be little affected by breakthroughs in the understanding of mathematics, but our civilization has been and can be greatly affected by these kind of breakthroughs. So there's more than enough to keep us all busy through the rest of this century and the next, and maybe after that, other further centuries. And all the assimilation of this not yet fully available material takes place against a background of continual innovations on the cutting edge of research. There's more work being produced all the time. The deep historical background is initially assimilated in a rough and ready sort of way, and those on the front lines read just enough of past work, whatever is judged to be important over the short term, historically speaking, to propel them further on their own discoveries. And they may never look back again, but some will look back. Thermodynamics presents us with another interesting case of the slow unfolding of ideas. We were only a few decades into the Industrial Revolution, driven at first by steam engines, when Sadi Carnot conceptualized the problem of a heat engine in purely abstract terms and wrote a short book about it. This abstract treatment of heat engines appeared early in the history of steam engines and industrialization, but this was only the beginning of thermodynamics, which has been developing ever since that time. And as it develops, it changes in the light of subsequent developments in scientific thought. So, for example, thermodynamics was at one time expressed in terms of molecules of gas and their pressure inside a container. And now they're expressed in quantum mechanical terms. Well, quantum mechanics didn't exist when Sadi Carnot wrote his Reflections on the Motive Force of Fire, but his ideas continue to be changed in the light of later scientific ideas. And so there's the basic ideas of thermodynamics. And of course, we've added to the laws of thermodynamics as time has progressed. And, Carnot himself didn't lay out the laws of thermodynamics. That's been subsequent scholarship that has done that, working at assimilating what Carnot initially produced in the light of subsequent scientific research and theory. We still haven't yet fully developed or fully come to understand thermodynamics, and given that the fate of the universe entire is often expressed in thermodynamic terms, especially heat death, our most comprehensive way of understanding the destiny of the universe, and therefore human destiny within the universe, is questionable. One human lifetime isn't enough to take it all in. And one human mind isn't enough to comprehend the whole of our intellectual tradition. But in the future, when we have augmented our lives and our minds, perhaps making our lives longer and perhaps making our minds more comprehensive, we may possess the time and the faculties to comprehend what we've done. The whole of human history, I should say, when the whole of human history has run its course, it too will leave a large but a finite record of itself, analogous to the finite record of classical antiquity that I mentioned earlier, and the finite record of medieval civilization. The various finite parts of this total record of humanity, like the finite record of classical antiquity and medieval civilization, might be mastered separately on their own, but the whole is quite beyond us in our current form. So can we take solace in the idea that the rate at which science is piling up is at least slowing down? This argument has been made many times that science has taken all the low-hanging fruit of knowledge and now is on its way to a long-term stagnation. Sometimes this view is presented with amusing quotes from the late 19th century about how science seems to have come to a halt since its flattering to our vanity that the greatest scientists of the 19th century couldn't and didn't anticipate the revolutionary scientific changes of the early 20th century. But we are, in our turn, no less blinkered than our 19th century colleagues. But the idea that science is about to stagnate or has already stagnated has also been argued competently by many philosophers of our own time. For example, I have often cited the book, maybe not in the Today in Philosophy of History, but in other contexts, I've cited this excellent book by Nicholas Rescher, Scientific Progress, a philosophical essay on the economics of research in natural science. It's an excellent book, as I said, even though I disagree with it, but he carefully lays out the case for science having primarily run its course and is headed for increasing stagnation and diminishing returns on the investment in research. But the more I think about science, the more I see it as being in its infancy. I don't deny that a lot of low-hanging fruit has been picked already, but so much has been passed over in the first harvest that there's plenty left over for the gleaners. If a particular branch of science makes no breakthroughs for a few decades, we shouldn't take that as evidence of anything other than a temporary stagnation. So we need to measure the progress of scientific ideas at the same scale as we measure the progress of intellectual history, of which it is a part. And therefore, it should be expected to exhibit its development over the longue durée, which we measure in centuries or millennia. Part of the slowness of the reception and development of ideas in human history, whether scientific or otherwise, is the perception of their irrelevance and inutility, with ideas seeming ephemeral, while the artifacts of what Braudel called material civilization seem solid and formidable. But this apparent ephemerality, I should say, of ideas is fundamentally a misperception. Ideas are far more durable than the artifacts of material civilization, repeatedly coming back to haunt us as long after we have thought ourselves to have been free of them. John Maynard Keynes famously said, quote, "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back," unquote. While Keynes placed the delayed influence of ideas in practical affairs in a sinister light, the key phrase he uses here is "a few years back." The academic scribbler to which Keynes refers was probably unknown during his lifetime, and his influence only unfolds in later history. And ideas can languish in neglect for centuries or even millennia. And we have many examples of this too. Bertrand Russell wrote in History of Western Philosophy, quote, "No one in Greek times supposed that conic sections had any utility. At last, in the 17th century, Galileo discovered that projectiles move in parabolas, and Kepler discovered that planets move in ellipses. Suddenly, the work that the Greeks had done from pure love of theory became the key to warfare and astronomy," unquote. There may be formal ideas like conic sections in use today, pursued in the Greek spirit that Russell called a pure love of theory, but which will only come into their application centuries or millennia from now. Mereology, or the pure theory of parts and wholes, has primarily been developed by logicians and philosophers rather than mathematicians, which is an interesting division of labor in the formal sciences. But this is a discipline that is yet to truly flower, and its eventual efflorescence will have to still come at some point in the future. And then after its efflorescence and its assimilation, then at some future date, perhaps, will come its practical application in the context of some civilization and its projects. So all we have is this early suggestion of ideas of work in mereology, but they haven't yet come to their fruition. For my part, I'm convinced that the day will come when Cantor's theory of transfinite numbers, developed, as Russell said of the Greeks in geometry, from pure love of theory, will eventually find its application more widely in human thought beyond mathematics. I might talk about this more in a future episode, but today I'm only going to mention it in passing. But I think, given the Longue Durée unfolding of intellectual history, that will ultimately require an infinite history for all our ideas to be exhaustively worked out. And an infinite history would require an infinite scale of time. Bertrand Russell once remarked about the paradox of Tristram Shandy, which is the problem that after 2 years, Tristram, who's the fictional hero of Lawrence Stern's novel, Tristram had only recorded the events of the first 2 days of his life. So it makes the task seem utterly impossible because life is going to stack up more quickly than it can be recorded. But Russell observed that if Tristram had lived an infinitely long life, no part of his autobiography would remain unwritten, since there would be a one-to-one correspondence between any point of time in his life and the later point of time when it's recorded. This seems very strange, but logically it's impeccable. And Russell mentioned in another context that it's only a medical impossibility to complete an infinite task. This medical possibility, however, impossibility, may not always obtain. In a remarkably visionary paper of 1979, Time Without End, Physics and Biology in an Open Universe, Freeman Dyson suggested the possibility of what he called eternal intelligences, which in the far distant future of a cold and dark universe would be able to squeeze out an infinite number of thoughts from a finite amount of energy. Obviously, there's no agreement on whether or not this is possible, but Dyson has at least proposed a scenario for a material realization of what philosophers call supertasks, which are completed infinite tasks, as I've suggested that the exhaustive working out of ideas might be an infinite task. In an essay I wrote some years ago, I asked the question, who will read the Encyclopedia Galactica? And the answer I gave was that Dyson's eternal intelligences could read the Encyclopedia Galactica. And I might have added that they might be the only beings capable of writing the Encyclopedia Galactica. Thanks for listening.